Here we go. So this topic may step on a few toes. If you're not a science major student, or if you've not studied chemistry and physics, and if you don't have science kind of burning down in your heart, you may tend to kind of gravitate towards these things that are called pseudosciences. And I'll be honest, I'm a science fiction junkie, and there's plenty of room in sci-fi for pseudoscience. You might even recognize the list that I'm going to show you here in a minute of things you're like, oh, I think that's kind of fun. But again, I have a slide coming up on what are hallmarks of science. If a true science, though, as the slide says, needs to be heavily involved with the scientific method, that is, observations need to be part of a true science. Of course, based upon your observations, we come up with hypotheses, and we talked about extensive testing, we talked about peer review, the scientific community to which you belong all getting involved. And again, your observations need to be consistent with your hypothesis, and at some point then your hypothesis can be elevated to a scientific theory, and perhaps, if it's quantifiable, to a scientific law. So that's science. So what are these pseudosciences? Well, oftentimes they'll end in the words ology and OLG, OLOGY. And that ology really means the study of. So you'll see what I mean, but they're pseudosciences. You may recognize Dr. Carl Sagan. I assume he's a doctor. He's somebody who stole my heart years ago. He's since passed away, but he was all about bringing the field of astronomy or astrophysics to normal people. So I just think Carl Sagan's done a lot of work in that area. But listed here to the side are things that end in OLOGY, the study of, and they are pseudosciences. They are not real sciences. They are false sciences. Astrology is not the same thing as astronomy. Astrology is basically how the stars were when you were born, how they influence your lives. And I know some people, that's the zodiac signs and stuff like that. Some people, I'm curious about it, but it's not it's not testable. You really can't predict. It's not science. Cryptozoology, if you're like studying but if you're a science fiction junkie about those kind of Bigfoot, those monsters that are elusive to the camera, that would be cryptozoology. Numerology, I think that's a kind of like astrology, but it's where how numbers influence your life. And ufology, hey, I just think that stuff's really interesting. I wouldn't say ufology is interesting, but I think it's kind of interesting to see what people think about UFOs. But I'll just kind of read this quote to you from Carl Sagan. He says, "I worry that, especially in the millennium as the millennium edges near, pseudoscience and superstition will seem year by year more tempting, the siren song of unreason more sonorous and attractive." He's just saying he's afraid that these false sciences are going to take over real science, and the line is going to become blurry and people aren't going to know what's happening. So what all are the hallmarks of science? Well, like the slide says, it might be harder to recognize real science from false or pseudoscience. It might be harder than you think. But the Copernican revolution actually is associated with kind of the budding of the scientific method, even though there were elements of the scientific method before Copernicus. Notice we have three things all kind of pointing here to science. One of them is very important to science. Not that you can't be a religious person, and I'd be glad to talk to you about my faith some other time, but if we're talking about science, it needs to be natural causes. That's a hallmark of science. The next one, it's one of my favorite. If you've ever heard of keep it simple, stupid, the KISS principle, hallmark of science. And that one's over here in this bubble. It basically says you need to go for the simplest, the simplest explanation of your phenomenon is the correct one. In astronomy, we kind of look at how, before we came up with this idea that the sun was in the center of our planets orbiting the sun, there were some just crazy, odd ideas where, of course, the Earth was at the center and of our system, and the sun orbited the Earth, and the planets orbited the Earth, and all this. And it was just kind of crazy, the ideas that they had to go through to make it work. Not simple at all. So keep it simple, stupid. The next one is that, and I think I've mentioned this before, that if it is a science, you need to be able to take your hypothesis and to apply it to predict things to happen. So, for instance, the study of UFOs, ufology, we really can't predict when and where we're going to see another event of aliens visiting us, quite frankly. So, it's not a science.